Welcome everyone to tonight's side event at the EU Pavillion. We are very excited to have you, and we hope you don't miss your first dinner date tonight, but at least it was worth it. I hope you will say us in 60 minutes. What are we doing here in this panel? We're speaking about from negotiations to enhancing ambition and strengthening implementation. And the topic is no less, no pressure, than what is the future of the UNFCCC process? So I think an important question to cover. We welcome you here, but we also welcome you online, wherever you sit in this world, with your links. And the topic, I think, it's quite a crucial one, because if you think about it, we've had 27 COPs so far. At the same time, we've temperatures where the world has never been hotter than today. So if you think about that, all the promises made, all the agreements signed, the question is, do we actually have an efficient process? Does it actually deliver the action we all need to this existential threat? And so I guess the simple question out of that is, how can we improve it? So I guess this could be the red thread for the next 60 seconds here. I'm glad we have an excellent small panel here. I would not say it's due to the process, but we are lacking two people that actually sit now in a closing session of subsidiary bodies. So I guess that testifies to the complexity and challenges of the process. We're hosting the panel for you tonight. My name is Kai Monheim. I'm director of the Center for Multilateral Negotiations. And we're supporting COP presidencies, including the current one, on how to design a good COP negotiation process. That's just quickly on us as a host and background. I'm turning straight away to my dear panelists to the left here, and curious to hear your opening statements around the topic that we just discussed. If you have, we're a small group, and I think that's actually a strength. If you have any immediate reactions to the panelists after their opening words, just shoot for it. I think that will make it all the more lively and engaging. We'll start with Ulrich, all the way down here. Ulrich Lennertz is at the European Union as a coalition bloc, another negotiation to have internally, I suppose. Ulrich, as deputy head of delegation for Belgium, you've been involved in this process since, you said, Poznan, so 2008. I guess a lot of years to collect experience how to maybe improve this process. Ulrich is also, for the EU, actually active in a project called the Future of the UNFCCC process. So we hope you're gonna maybe tell us some of the findings from this process in a moment, and maybe a key idea that strikes you as, why don't we do this to change the process for the better? Ulrich.
Yes, thanks for having me in this panel. It's a pet topic of me, and I really look forward to have this conversation. You asked me about my experience in working within the EU on future of UNFCCC. Maybe I can say a few words on how we launched the work. I think it was immediately after Paris, and all of a sudden we were confronted with a proposal from Australia. That was a proposal to change the frequency of the COP meetings. And within the EU, we were like, we didn't like the proposal much because it lacked the sense of urgency. But when we wanted to define how we would respond to the proposal, we quickly came to the conclusion that what we really needed was a clear vision on what the UNFCCC process would look like once the rulemaking was finished. Once we would be in what we saw as the upcoming era on implementation and and ambition. And giving that a thought was well, immediately showed the complexity of that question. Because if you look at a process that grows organically, like UNFCCC has done over the decades, and a process that has very much the rule making at its center, you of course have a design that is made in function of that rule making, and that means agendas with very well defined mandates. It means a strong focus in negotiations. Every word, every comma counts, because you establish rules that are there to stay for everyone for decades. And it also is a kind of an inward-looking type of process. But if you then look at or imagine a process that fits for implementation, that fits for ambition, that is a completely other type of process. That is a process of dialogue with all the stakeholders involved, with less looking at the words and the commas. It is a process that is much a dialogue with a lot of interaction and very open, outward looking, because you need everyone in to get to implementation and ambition. So that was the first general conclusion, you could say.
Okay.
But then comes the next complexity. How do you translate that in more practical terms? I just mentioned the differences between both, but you have to translate it in concrete changes to the process. And what makes it even more difficult, you have to do it in a process that is running. It's not a drawing table where you design something. You have to change something that is very dear to so many people. And well, I will not make my initial intervention too long, but what our conclusion then was that we could translate it in 5 changes to the process.
What was your favorite one?
I think my favorite one has to do with making sure that you put the issues that deal with accountability, the global stocktake at the collective level, the multilateral assessment at the more national level, put them much more at the center, and structure your planning of the meetings around them, and make them as fora for engagement. But there's much more to it. That is just one of them. But I'll leave it with that to start.
Thank you very much, Ulrich. And I'm positively surprised because negotiations must make progress if Archie is in the room now. Welcome, Archie. Fantastic to have you as well. Thank you, Ulrich, for getting us started with a first concrete idea, I guess. Fairly concrete we are. Donald, if we turn to you, Donald Cooper, Director at the UNFCCC Secretariat for the Transparency Division, of course has had a life before, as you shared it, was Executive Secretary of the Stockholm Convention, has been at COP since 2013 for the Secretariat, and has even had the pleasure to ratify another important protocol, which was the Montreal Protocol on ozone. So Donald, with a handful and a bag of experience on good processes here, I'm very happy to have you. And Donald, if you maybe, we heard Ulrich, and I take it, Ulrich, if I may, from Belgium with a country perspective also. Donald, maybe if you could put a UN hat on, if you may, for a moment, because in a way, if we think about the process, I guess the Secretariat is in a difficult position, because you have accumulated institutional good practices, right, over years and years and years. And at the same time, we all know the mantra, it is a party-driven process. So whilst you may have some good recommendations in mind, the question is, what is the patient doing? Is anyone listening to thoughts? So from your perspective, Donald, what would you say, what needs to change? Maybe if you also look critically at your experience at the Secretariat, and you've been at another Secretariat, from a Secretariat organizational point of view, to make this process more effective.
Thank you very much. And of course, no pressure there.
Not at all, Donald.
I would also like to use the opportunity as a member of the Secretariat, who is not normally one of those who are upfront in giving suggestions on how things that parties decide on may go. But I would like for us to consider this concept of from negotiation to implementation. And the reality is that we are really already in the implementation. We're not moving from the negotiations to the implementation. And the negotiations will still go on because you will always have to clarify things. But the positions are clear enough that the non-government bits of the world can act. Automobile industry can act. Electricity companies can act. So we've already been successful that way. Now, if you look at what's happening with our COPs, at this one, there'll be over 66,000 participants. Clearly, all 66,000 of them are not there to negotiate on loss and damage. In fact, almost all of them are here on the implementation side. Right? So we've already gone there. Mm-hmm. So the question in our minds from the Secretariat is, how do you now accommodate that? Also, when you are negotiating a treaty, a legally binding agreement, governments have a difficulty in including non-government people who are not going to be bound to it. If we're now dealing with the implementation, that tent opens up wide because you can now bring all of those different players in. And the question is the manner in which you bring them in. The fact that we're having this discussion shows that the thinking of parties has already moved to the point where we want to bring them all in. They don't participate in the negotiations, but certainly they move a $1 billion contribution to a $1 trillion contribution. And that is the power of bringing everybody else in. And I'm going to end there because I want to hear how the others come, and then maybe I can elaborate further on some suggestions we might have on how you might be able to do that.
Great. Thank you, Donald. Thank you for that argument. We are in the middle of implementation already. And probably implementation also means negotiation, but of a different kind. So negotiation may be with us for another few decades, I suppose. I hope it's not a threat to anyone, but maybe that just happens. Justin, Donald just spoke about the actual action and implementation, and I guess you are a good representative of someone who needs to act because you actually work at a big corporation that can be part of the solution, if possible, at Novozymes, head of sustainability partnerships, as it was a biotech company. Now, you're also representing Bingo as a constituent, and you're at the International Chamber of Commerce. Similar to Ulrich, it's interesting because on this panel now we have Ulrich, who is involved at the general question of the reform process, and luckily we got Justin, who is involved in a similar reform project at the Secretariat, which focuses on the role of observers in the process. So maybe it's a nice compliment here to have you. And now, Justin, we need to tell us a few secrets. And I warned you about that before. And so the question would be, and this stays in the room maybe, if you think of the past month, the debates you had internally in the reform process, how do we bring observers more into it? We trust this is not an easy conversation that you've been having. Can you tell us a few of the tensions that you've witnessed in these debates when it comes to reforming the process?
Well, thank you, Kai. I just want to say two things first off. Donald's one of the unsung heroes of this process. The transparency team do some amazing work, and it would be remiss of me not to say thank you to Archie for Team UK last year and a fantastic COP. This is the whole thing. COP is now becoming a layer cake. You have negotiations, you have implementation, and as a lot of us can hear behind us, there's a mass amount of side events going on. It's nearly 8 o'clock on a Saturday night, because this process at the end of the day is about people. So from a private sector perspective, it's important to understand this process. It's not always the easiest thing in the world. There's lots of abbreviations, there's lots of acronyms, but it matters. Because when a business looks at this, it will try and translate that into its own business, its own language, its own strategy, its own investment process. And then, as my CEO did earlier this week, will then double down on its science-based targets, because it can understand. But it's that translation process that I think is key. Just to throw one acronym into this sort of conversation, the process that Kai is referring to is, it goes under AIM, so Arrangements for Institutional Meetings. This conversation's going on. It's complex, it's complicated. As one of my colleagues likes to joke, says, Justin, when you go to these things, it's like trying to get 190 plus people to arrange a dinner and figure out the menu, and everyone's going to eat the same thing. And I know that's a sort of a light way of looking at it, because it is very, very serious. But just imagine the complexity that these guys are dealing with, trying to get these conversations going. I think what I certainly feel in this COP is that gear shift towards implementation. And through that process, of course, it brings in all kinds of non-state actors. It brings in indigenous peoples, it brings in farmers, it brings in youth, it brings in business, it brings in environmental NGOs. And the key word that I have in my head is inclusion. The more we can include people, the more we can get people to participate, and most importantly, collaborate and contribute with their specific elements, activities, be it investment, innovation, be it helping a business even learn from the other constituency groups what it means to actually start putting renewable technologies into an area that might be sensitive for environmental reasons or for social reasons or for traditional indigenous reasons. So there's a double learning process here, and I think that's a really important point. So part of the tension I think that you're referring to is everyone is trying to learn from each other at the same time within that community, and everyone is also trying to figure out the best way to actually engage and actively contribute. And the Secretariat, to its credit, is really trying to listen and learn and encourage that dialogue, because that's the other key word. It's dialogue. I have a friend who's half Brazilian, half Lebanese, and he always tells me, Justin, you've got 2 ears, 1 mouth, please use them in those quantities, because it's so important to get that conversation going in the right way. I think also in that process, it's really important to set some ground rules. And I think the key one that's come out through these conversations is a very simple one, that any observer organization is there because it supports implementation of the Paris Agreement. That's the red line really in terms of how we have to drive this forward. And the second thing is, we should be supporting each other. So last year, the business community actually wrote a letter on behalf of the indigenous community. And there's a reason for that. It's because this is an inclusive process. So there cannot be any differentiation between the observer groups. That said, we need to find better ways of actually getting people, especially from the global south, to be part of these conversations. There are some ideas floating around having some workshops to really make sure that engagement mechanism is in place so that we can come at the right time, in the right way, with the right contribution.
Thank you, Justin. If I may get back to my footnote on secrets just for a second. Sorry, Justin.
I don't have that many.
If you think, or maybe it's not a secret, but just to help us a little to understand, because obviously observers are not one block, right? They have, you said it, right? They have different interests. They should all meet the same menu. Clearly, they probably don't have the same appetite for every same thing. So if you think of this reform debate, what was a difficult area, you would say, when you were discussing this between different groups? Maybe the dividing lines were within the bingo, who knows? But like, can you share maybe one of that just to illustrate?
Yeah. I think probably one of the thing, and Donald's also said it, 66,000 people. I had it at 52,000, but you're telling me 66. Is that the right number for this COP? That's insane. So, yeah. Okay, so there's 14,000 observers, I think, at the last COP, of which...
Archie, you had it so easy.
Yeah, you had an easy time, didn't you? But I think within that probably comes to the heart of your question, that there's a lot of focus from particularly environmental NGOs, quite rightly. There's a lot of focus from trade unions, quite rightly. And again, a lot of focus from business. How do we make sure we get the right people in the room? And I think that probably goes to the heart of this dialogue. Everyone wants to be here, and I quite understand why. I think it's also, and this is one thing I always tell my colleagues, this is not a 2-week event. This is a year-long process. You need to engage, you need to understand, come and do the PR stunt if that's what you want. Most businesses have done that 10 years ago, and they won't do it anymore because they're here to actually listen, learn, and contribute. So I think it's that level of participation is just exploding, and it's very, very hard for the Secretariat just to manage that. And I think that level of enthusiasm and willingness and drive to actually change things is probably the biggest source of tension right now, because you could say, well, let's have an equal number of each constituent present, for example, or we could say we need to look in terms of geography. It's that kind of granularity that I think is key. So whether there needs to be some conversation around how we get better balance on that. But I think, as I said earlier on, the way that we look at it is we don't come here with anything other than our shirt sleeves rolled up. We're not here to show off. We're here to show up and help.
Good. Thank you, Justin. Archie, I hope you took a time to breathe after that day. Glad to have you. Archie has been longest standing lead negotiator of a COP presidency, I guess, thanks to COVID. So we suppose, Archie, you were up on a very long-lasting high learning curve when it comes to running COP processes. Now, the pity is, as you're up on your learning curve, you're also out in your role for the COP presidency and the COP presidency as such. And we have the next host country, of course. So another question when we were thinking about this panel was, is there actually a point in strengthening the Secretariat in that process as COP countries, as they try their very best, every time have to start from the scratch and all over again? And if we think of another regime like the trade negotiations, we have had the GATT negotiations going on for decades, and at some point countries said, we better establish the WTO and really make this an as strong regime with all its difficulties it has, but just to change that momentum and dynamic. Long question, looking forward to your answer. Hi, Archie.
Thank you very much, Kai. And first, apologies for being late. Thank you for the invitation. Actually, the reason I'm late is because, sadly, it seems as though the role of being presidency doesn't actually ever end. I've just done 4 hours of consultations for the Egyptian presidency on their behalf. It appears it didn't finish on Sunday, like we thought. No, but it's an honor to be invited, and I'm going to have to leave early because I've got 2 more hours immediately after this. But that does tell you that the negotiations continue. And that they continue to be challenging and difficult. I absolutely think there is already a very strong secretariat, and I think that the role that the secretariat plays, as Justin said, is often underplayed. I do think the role of the secretariat differs from COP presidency to COP presidency, and Don can say more about that. But you have different priorities, different systemic approaches, different cultural approaches. That's part of what I think makes COPs so interesting, the way that they rotate, but also it makes it so important that we have the continuity, the consistency, the historic knowledge from the Secretariat, and we certainly appreciated it. If I can just say a couple of other things which I think are pertinent to the conversation about just our role here as well. And when I see the title about negotiations to enhancing ambition, one of the things that often troubled me is actually the terminology we use and the fact that we describe what we do as negotiations. Some of it is negotiation. But actually, when you take a step back, what do the people of the world want us to be doing, government representatives? It's not necessarily negotiate, it's to construct. So please, anybody in the audience who can come up with a better term for constructor-in-chief or facilitate, just some way of actually capturing the fact that, yes, there are disagreements that need to be worked through, but fundamentally, if we see this as a zero-sum game, then everybody loses. And the more we can look at this positive collective effort to build the systems, the mechanisms, and we have done a lot of that. But also, that sense of construction, I think, gives us a sense of what the role is when it comes to implementation. Because once you have constructed something, you do not simply sit back and kind of move on to the next thing. You need to make sure that it continues to be fit for purpose, that it is fulfilling the purpose that originally intended. And many years ago, I worked in our Prime Minister's Delivery Unit, so a unit at the heart of our number 10, which actually tracked every single commitment. Were we doing what we said we would do? And I think that there is a real need, given the number of commitments that we had in Glasgow, building on those before, that we have that follow through, that accountability, not just for government commitments. So yes, the Glasgow Climate Pact had a number such as doubling, developed countries doubling adaptation finance, revisiting and strengthening NDCs, but actually those wider commitments, the 140 countries representing over 90% of the world's forests that committed to deforestation, the commitments on zero-emission vehicles, the number of other commitments, I think we should also consider what is the role, and it may be that the role is minimal, it may be the role is a platform or a space to provide updates, but I do think that sense of follow-through needs to be not just governments, but broader.
Thank you, Archie. Maybe one follow-up question on this notion of, this is not a negotiation, we are constructing something together, which also, if I understand you right, has something to do with mindset of negotiators at the table. What could you concretely change? I mean, if we think next COP, what could you change to go more towards that mindset? What concretely could change?
Well, if I had the answer to that, we would have tried to do some of these things differently in Glasgow, perhaps. I think given the mindset side, the more we can do to bring in science, statistics, facts into our work, the better. We have an incredible foundation and bedrock of science through the work of the IPCC. And it is actually a comment that was made by a colleague at a meeting a little while ago, which was unfair, but they described sometimes there can be a tendency to use facts the same way that drunk people use lampposts for support rather than for illumination. And perhaps we can find ways of bringing in facts, science, statistics, genuine progress updates in order to inform our negotiations and to make sure we start from a common platform of understanding. Then I think we can build what we're trying to build together in a more constructive way.
Okay, thank you, Archie. It seems like the lamppost example has inspired a question or a comment from Ulrich. Ulrich.
Yes, indeed, and certainly that issue on terminology as well. One of the observations that we had when we were making that, when we were doing that, having that discussion on future of UNFCCC, was precisely the disconnect that we saw in some of the COPs preceding the COP in Glasgow, with a COP very much focused on precise negotiations, issues on transparency, aspects of Article 6, while the outside world very much having a debate on ambition, on science, and expecting that those issues would be the big issues at stake at the COP, while the COP was dealing with other issues, which then creates a big tension, even a kind of expectation management in terms of COP presidencies, but an expectation management that you never can win, because that public expectation is rightfully so strong and so rich in terms of understanding the challenge that you cannot think of a narrative saying, well, we understand the expectations, but we decided to focus just on a few other issues. And in that sense, I really can only congratulate Archie and their team, because what they did was constructing a COP that had these different layers, that brought the public discussions on ambition, on finance, on mitigation, on adaptation at the forefront at the COP, that had the engagement agendas, bringing all the stakeholders in, and then a third layer on the actual negotiations in the terms that we mostly understand it. And when I would describe what a COP is about, for us it's a kind of platform that brings together all the actors, and they need to respond to the requirements of science, while part of that is negotiations, but it's much larger.
Maybe, thank you, Ulrich. Maybe if we connect these, you were making reference to Archie and Glasgow and the different levels of outcomes, right, that were achieved in the formal process and towards the public. I think one argument that has been floating around since Glasgow was there were fantastic initiatives, right, on deforestation and getting out of fossil fuel subsidies, etc. And then we're saying it's mid-November, a year later now, and what happened to the initiatives? Like, where is the action that we were maybe hoping for? I suppose some has happened, but was it satisfactory? And what does it have to do with the process? Maybe I put this back open, and please, I also invite comments from the audience. Yes?
It's a really good question, and it's one that we've actually been asking every single country for the last 11 months, 12 months since Glasgow. We have made that our mission as presidency for our presidency year, is ensuring the follow-through and the delivery on everything that was committed, both by governments and by non-state actors. And your point on inclusion earlier, I think, was absolutely right for that. One example of that follow-through was in May, jointly with the Egyptian then incoming presidency, we hosted the May Ministerial on Implementation, which brought a selection of governments together to precisely say, well, actually, some serious commitments were made in Glasgow at that point, merely 6 months before. And of course, everybody after a COP has this kind of, right, okay. And then everybody has that exhale. But actually, we wanted to make sure that exhale needed to stop and people needed to be cracking on with delivery. What I think is also really interesting is to see some of the requests for agenda items that have come forward at this COP, which have been explicitly termed in phrases around follow-through, implementation, tracking, understanding what has happened since. In terms of some of the non-state actor, the broader coalitions, when we go around the world, and in fact the government commits as well, we effectively have our spreadsheet. We're not very popular people because we turn up and we go through our spreadsheets and we say, well, you made this commitment, you made this commitment, you made this commitment. Where are you? Where are you? Where are you on this? What support do you need? How can we help? Here are other countries who are trying to do the same thing in a different way. We can, like I say, people don't ask us back, But we thought that was actually an important role for the COP presidency to be doing, having brought people to these commitments to help them with the follow through. I think looking forward with the global stocktake and the role of both Egypt moving forward and then the UAE, I think there's a really interesting model to build on there.
Okay. Thank you for sharing with us the unpopular role you have been playing secretly behind closed doors. And maybe we pick up this point for a moment, also on Justin, because at the end of the day, where's the action taking place? I guess it's in countries, right? It's on the ground, and it's probably not governments by themselves doing it, right? So one question back would be, how can we, on a domestic national level, get more teeth sort of to the tiger of ambition after someone signs something nice in a COP, right? What can happen at the capital? How can we support that process? Maybe business can help. Justin.
Yeah, can I maybe just come on, in on the main ministerial, because...
On the Excel list, right?
Yeah, well, it's actually because credit, where credit is due to particularly the governments of the UK, Egypt and Denmark, who actually hosted physically the event. Inclusion, my favourite word of the evening. All of the observer groups were actually invited along to that conversation, and all of us contributed. I think it was a very honest conversation, and I think being here now in Sharm, a lot of the conversation on finance in all its forms and flavours, I think, can be tracked back to that meeting and the way that it was constructed. It was a very honest, open dialogue, particularly in terms of the Global South representation that was there. Back to your other comment, I think this is also about accountability. I like to tell my colleagues that you may have billions of dollars in revenues and thousands of employees, but you've got one reputation. So if you're going to get into this space, if you're going to make a public commitment, you need to deliver on it. So I'm very fortunate. So my CEO was in Glasgow, said we're going to double down on science-based targets. Here in Sharm, we've done exactly that. So we've gone with Science-Based Targets Initiative. We're now, for scopes 1 and 2, 75%. For scope 3, 35%. And we've moved that forward 5 years to 2030. That's a direct result. And that's back to what Archie is saying, keeping the pressure on and actually making sure people deliver on what they say they're going to do. It's not an easy task, especially from a private sector perspective, just as it's not an easy task for a government to be part of this process. But if you commit, you try and follow through. And I think that's the key thing in all of this as well. Particularly, as I said earlier on, it isn't the easiest process to follow, but if you take the time to actually learn and engage, it actually pays off. Because, of course, for us, we get direct questions. I think the week after Glasgow, we were getting questions from some pretty large financial, and asset managers saying, "What do you think of the Glasgow outcomes?" And we were there. So we knew what was going on.
Sorry?
We said to them, well, we were there in person. We know exactly what was going on. And it gives us that extra credibility. So it gives us an edge in terms of actually taking this from a corporate perspective and using it to our advantage. But it doesn't mean we don't deliver on social issues or environmental issues at the same time. It's that triangulation that's really, really important.
Okay. Thank you, Justin. Yes, please, Donald.
This leads exactly into one of the points we have been quietly suggesting to quite a number of parties. We generally place that burden of ambition and the implementation on the parties because they're the ones who negotiated the treaty. Leaving that exactly as it is, if we can also place that same burden of ambition and implementation on all the rest of the world and encourage them during the year in between a COP to take up these challenges, which either the government where they're living or hosting them or the commitments they give, and we focus on that at the upcoming COP. In other words, you are working towards your celebration of achievement and where you are looking for further expansion and increase of your ambition. But to not just have that as a party part, but also the others. Celebrate what you are doing, and so that your friends want to join the party next time around. Right? All of the indigenous people, all of their fantastic things that they're doing, challenge them. Gender, farming, local communities, cities, challenge them. Because when you look at the accumulated ambition that a country gives, it's what they think they can push their people, corporations, and so on to achieve. But if the people, corporations, cities, and everyone is telling them, hey, we can go further than that, then it allows the parties themselves to also increase their ambition. So it's one of the suggestions that we hope will get taken up over the course of the next year, where we will focus very, very strongly on promoting that ambition. One of the things that made Glasgow very successful, right at the very beginning, there were these announcements, pronouncements, partnerships, where everybody was starting off on a high. Yes, we intend to do this. We have formed a partnership. We are working. And that carried on through. And that had a huge impact on the negotiations because the atmosphere was already, we are going to do, and we want to show that we are doing. So I'm hoping that this kind of engagement can carry forward. And because it's not a direct negotiation of a legally binding treaty, the door is wide open for all of these participants to come on board. It's up to the parties and ourselves to figure out the best way of doing it. But if we emphasize that this is what we wish to do, then I think finding the way becomes easier.
Okay. Thank you, Donald. Maybe we take a country example here from Belgium and ask Ulrich for a moment, I quote Donald, challenge the parties, right? What have they done? I don't know how your Excel visit went with Belgium. Archie, maybe you tell us later what boxes were ticked and which ones are open. But seriously, Ulrich, like from a national implementation perspective, do you see that challenging? I mean, if you take Belgium as an example, are the groups around? Which kind of groups are they? Do you work towards implementing these promises there? How does it work on a national level, from your perspective?
I think there's not a single answer to that question. I think when it comes down to NDCs or to long-term strategies, the answer is quite simple, because those are the key vehicles for our climate policies. So I mean, of course, we function within the EU. We have the Fit for 55 package and the EU decision to go climate neutral by 2050 as NDC and LTS, and that is translated in legislation. There's sectoral legislation reinforcing it, etc. And so for Belgium, there it's a lot of implementing that legislation. But anyway, that is very much at the core. That there is no question about it. The challenge is much more with the follow-up of the initiatives, because there's always a when there are lots of initiatives on the agenda of a COP, the delegations before signing up, they ask themselves pretty simple questions that maybe are not the ones that you would like them to ask, but they look at others who did sign up this as well. And the other question that they ask themselves is, to what extent do we already have policies that are in line with that initiatives? Mm-hmm. Which doesn't mean that the initiatives are not valuable in terms of strengthening the commitment in that sense, but it kind of shows that governments are, at least feel that they are a bit overstretched in implementing implementing commitments and are somewhat cautious, and that also means that after a COP, it is very important that there is a good follow-up, that you are questioned, that there are like meetings. They can be virtual, to share how the follow-up is done, and the follow-up is diverse. I have to admit, we have an example on the initiative for public investments, moving away from fossil fuels. Well, we had very complicated but very substantial government discussions on how to implement that, how to involve our agencies that are responsible for export credits. So all the ministers that are somewhat involved were very much part of that one, while others, they resemble too much legislation that we already have, and so they kind of get they don't get that specific follow-up.
Okay, Archie.
Can I actually just change the focus as well a bit?
Please.
And bring in Kate, because I think it's very easy for us sitting here as governments to kind of say, this is how we see it. But actually, I'd be really interested in your take as to, both as somebody who has worked on the process and knows these institutions, but also as a citizen, what do you expect from us in terms of follow-through and accountability?
So I guess I was hoping to avoid speaking.
Archie caught you. There's no way out.
Yeah, I really was hoping to avoid speaking. That was a tricky question that I wasn't expecting. I guess what I expect from governments, public consultation, public involvement. From my own perspective, I don't know that I see enough of it in my own country, South Africa. My government would probably argue otherwise. But yeah, I think that more involvement in the public, more awareness, more to go towards Justin's favorite word of the night, more inclusion. I don't know if that helps any.
And maybe Kate, we can take that question actually to people in the audience here and ask if you had a wish to, because they can make it happen, if you had a wish to them when it comes to inclusion, really, of civil society, observer groups, businesses, at the COP, what would be a wish? If you had a magic stick, what would you ask them for? Is there anything that comes to mind? Yes, please. The first wish is a microphone, I take it. And then you have a voice. And then, can you briefly say your background and who you are?
Hello, hello.
Archie needs to run, and maybe if you just wait for 1 second, Archie. Yes, you have to run, literally. Okay, Archie, good luck. We'll tell you the wish afterwards.
Bye,
Don't
Archie.
worry. Good luck, Archie.
Okay, my wish would be, I would be happy or keen to see more business associations present here their roadmaps in a proactive way, conveying to the public what actually, technologically speaking, is in the room that could deliver on the transition. So I would like to see more commitment and less this, let's say, cooperation amongst peers in a sector where it's just fighting the progress because the incumbents stick to their own old business models. So this is so myself, I'm Daniel Scholz, I'm from FutureCamp. I know this from my own work with companies. We have proactive companies and we have those who are not just laggards, who object against anything that is happening on the progress side. And I would be happy and keen to see industry correcting themselves by sector, assessing, like the peer review amongst, we see it here in amongst nations, telling who is obstructing and who is cooperating.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. May we collect one more, and Justin can prepare himself for answering on the question on corporations. Please.
Good evening. My name is Nadia Haddad. I'm from the European Disability Forum, and I'm also a citizen from Belgium. So when it's about implementation and negotiation, we I heard about inclusion, and I see in the beginning of the session, act now. So we really want to be more involved. And we wish that within the UNFCC that we have a climate action plan where persons with disabilities are also part of it. When we speak about inclusion, it's meaningful involvement from the beginning and not being consulted only at the end, because we are also stakeholders and actors for social change. So it will be one of our biggest wish to have a climate action plan that include the rights of persons with disabilities, because within other UN treaty bodies, it's about implement, protect, and fulfill. So we really be glad if you take this up as a big ambition to realize. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm looking at the time, so may we give the panelists a moment to reply to these two questions. Maybe the corporate question. Oh, okay. Yeah, one more, a speed question, I guess. 3 minutes left.
Thank you. Question of how we can get more objective transparency. If I take the issue of the 100 billion that was committed at Copenhagen for raising, which hasn't happened. The OECD did all sorts of clever numbers which were not really understandable. How can we push out the job of being a objective reporter on performance and putting it out to a non-political body?
Thank you. I would say, looking at the time, thank you. We'll leave it there with the 3 questions, and let's just take them in order. Maybe Justin, do you want to go on the first question?
I'll take the business. I mentioned earlier on that we got validated science-based targets for net zero. We're actually the 87th company in the world to do that. I'd like to see another 87 and another 87 and another 87 actually take that journey and move ahead. Currently, there's about 2,000 companies with SBTI targets just in that space. But I do think it's a very fair point that we need to figure out how, as businesses, we work not just in our own, operations or backyard, but start thinking scopes 1, 2, and 3, and start thinking value chains and supply chains and SMEs, because that's the only way we're going to really address that. The more you bring in an ecosystem, then I think you create actually more change.
Thank you.
I'm also extremely conscious of one thing at a COP, and it's time, and we always run out of time.
Like we do in a moment. Maybe you, Donald, if you would like to take the question on disability, and maybe you have been executive secretary in other regimes, maybe there's something we can learn from.
I thought you would ask me to take the one on transparency, since that's what I actually run. But I fully agree. It is now only becoming a reality that we are acknowledging that there are far more groups than we thought. And the more that come in, the more productive the system becomes. And I would certainly fully endorse that persons with disabilities, any other group which feels that they want to contribute, they should be welcome to contribute. Every single bit helps.
And maybe, why don't you take 2, the transparency question? I have a last one for you, Ulrich, and then we finish.
With regards to the accountability, it's a lot of discussion going on at the moment, how to take business and industry's pledges, put in place a mechanism of reporting, and allow them to earn certification to show that they've reached their goals. And I can see this coming in sooner rather than later. The Secretary General, in his first presentation, I believe, foreshadowed this. And exactly as you are discussing, I can see that coming in very soon. And not just for industry, maybe gender group have set themselves goals and targets, and they would like to be acknowledged for achieving those. All of this ambition being measured outside of the government is definitely the right way to go.
Thank you, Donald. And if you think maybe it remains interesting to follow up on where's this process heading in terms of reform and change, we look forward to a report on observer engagement. Justin, the group you're in, when can we expect that?
Exact date off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure it's within the next 2 to 3 months. So
Great, 2 to 3 months on the website of the Secretariat, I believe. And Ulrich, the hardest question for you, when are you done with your reform process overall, where you are involved in on the UNFCCC process? Can you give us a year at least, or a decade?
I think it's an open-ended exercise.
Okay, it's an open-ended exercise. Makes it even more exciting to follow. Thank you, all panelists. Saturday evening, I know there are better things to do than being on a panel, but you were fantastic. Thank you for taking the time. And thank you, everyone in the audience. I wish you a pleasant Saturday, end of the first week of the COP. And I wish all of us a successful COP27 here in Egypt and a better process for the future. Thank you very much.